only the Fianna can do that because they're right on the border. So during the season, at the dark of the year, you tell these stories about the people who can do this, the people who cross across this boundary. And that is going to bring fertility back to your community. This is going to encourage everything in the land around you, everything, all the energies that are involved around you, to collaborate in this passing across the border from the wild to the human, to the civilized. Now, how are you going to do this to get people's attention? There are a series of formulaic practices whereby the storyteller, first of all, indicates to his audience what kind of story this is. Because the storyteller can tell all kinds of stories. He can warm up a session of storytelling by telling stories that he knows are not really sacred stories. A lot of these are stories that we call international folk tales. You know, these are stories that, sort of like a lot of Grimm's fairy tales have that pattern. You find them in many, many different countries across Europe and Asia. They've obviously been sort of imitated by one storyteller from other storytellers, so that you have similar versions from China and from Ireland. And these stories are known everywhere, and sometimes they're actually descended from mythological stories that used to have a more strong ritualistic meaning. But when the people tell them, they know that this is not an important myth. So they're not usually presented in the same way. You can tell this is a warm-up story, right? That we're telling right now. We're going to get into the really heavy story that is going to be presented more carefully in a ritual way, and then you're going to have to pay greater attention, obviously, because you'll be cued into paying greater attention to the more mythological story. So in different Celtic communities, you have different ways of doing this, of entering into this kind of mythological space. It's really a way of setting sacred space for the telling of the story. Certain words tell you that, okay, this is the way it's going to be. In Brittany, there are several ways of inducing this state. One of my favorite ones is a very short one, is saying, "Elvishiwa, Elvishniwa kit, Elvishiwa bipred." And it means literally, once there was, once there wasn't, once there always was. And on one level you could say Elvishiwa bipred just simply means, once it was anyway, but the way it's phrased in a sort of slightly stilted manner makes you think, what does that mean? That something actually was, but it wasn't, and nevertheless, in all circumstances it was. So this tells you that the story is going to be a myth, right? This is something that is true. It doesn't have to be factual. It didn't necessarily happen at any one particular time, and yet in some ways it has always happened. Another way of doing it in Brittany, there's a Silhouette gekliffet, markaret gekleedfet, markaret nekleedfet kid, situemus de laret. And that's a very common one that's used. It means listen and you'll hear. If you want, you'll believe it. If you don't want to, you won't believe it. But this is what I have to say. And that's sort of a less heavy introduction. And another one that's very commonly used in the north of Brittany is Elvishiwa, Elvishivo. Commencement an olgozo. Nisus namar namartizin, inus trisroad dantriben. And it's an enigmatic statement. It says, once there was, and once there will be. This is the way all talk begins. And there is no if or maybe about it. The tripod has 3 legs. So that again introduces the fact that you're at the same time talking about something that's true now that was true in the past and that will still be true in the future. And it's an indisputable fact. So you have to believe this particular story. In Irish, at least in Connemara, there's a formula that's sort of longish and that introduces just about all stories that are meant to be taken in that spirit. It says, "Vi an fadó vi, the main chanur shanan, ni vein an ishan, the main an ish agus an ur shanan, vir skil ur na shen skilagum, the vein ganein skil." And then you run into the story. So it's actually hard to translate, but it means, there once was, a long time ago there was. Now, if I had been there that time, I wouldn't be here now. Yes. And if I were here now and that time, then I would have another story at me and an old story at the same time. Right? Or I might be without any story at all. And anyway, and then it goes launches into the actual story. But the effect of all of these phrases is that it confuses the audience as to the factual nature of the story and when the story is supposed to be taking place, and their relation to the story as either people in the here and now hearing something about the here and now, or hearing something about the ancient past, or hearing about something that is true of both now and the ancient past.
Could I ask a question?
Sure.
Did they have endings for stories
Yes.
that were ritualized in
Yes.
the same way?
And I'm going to get to them, but well,
But not yet.
I'll get to
They
them
were
in a
sort
moment.
of telling people to suspend judgment at
Right.
the outset.
Yes, and also the idea that this is a story that has to be believed, but it's not a factual story, and yet it's true.
Okay.
It's truer than many factual stories, is the idea. So, talking about in Scotland, people are usually do it simpler. They simply say, "Van der Vishal," there was before this time, just simply placing the event in the past. Now, the endings of stories in Ireland, very typically, the meaning of the story is given by the ending. The way you end a story, a great story, an important story in the west of Ireland, is Beannacht Dé le Hanam na Marav, the blessing of God on the souls of the dead. That's the end of every story. Because each story is a gift, is an offering to the ancestors. And that's the ultimate meaning of the story. For this is a communing with the ancestors. This is a gift to the ancestors. We're reviving their time. They have been present. And, of course, in a Christianized setting, you ask for the blessing of God on their souls. The stories, as I said, can be of many different kinds. The centerpiece of a storytelling session during the winter months would be a Fíneacht story, a story about Finn McCool and his men. An adventure, usually which involves either the saving of a girl who represents fertility, sovereignty, sort of the correct functioning of the community, usually represented as a woman who is able to give life and to continue things, and sometimes as a kind of regaining of power that was lost, very much like the Arthurian stories about the wasteland, about the Fisher King who loses his virility, right, is wounded, and you have to go to the land of women where the Holy Grail is in order to return that fertility to the here and now after the land has been made waste. Very many Fenian stories have that at their center.